From downtown Decatur, it's the Faber Files. Hello, I'm your host, Bill Faber. Because democracy demands debate, we present this program, a program of community interests and issues. Tonight's program features two segments. The first is titled The Great Awakening, Lincoln and Religion in the 1800s. The second segment is titled The Games and Toys of Lincoln's Era. Segment 1 features a fascinating talk about Abraham Lincoln, his religious beliefs, and the climate of religion in American life during his time. Chris Small, a minister and Lincoln actor from Greenville, Tennessee, is our speaker. You cannot begin to understand Lincoln or his times or the Civil War era unless you hold some knowledge about religion in the 1800s. Segment 2 of tonight's program is a historical view of the games and toys of Lincoln's time. Kathleen Jensen, a lovely actress, portrays Mary Todd Lincoln as she explains and demonstrates the many games of Lincoln's days. It's said that Lincoln enjoyed playing checkers. His companions knew him as a careful but slow player of the game. I hope you enjoy this wonderful and unique program. Thanks for watching.
Bachelor's degree in religion, communication, master's in communication, interpretation, performance studies, and things like that.
He's doing this at my request. I drafted him for this presentation. I thought that it would be good for us as background, not specifically about Lincoln, but about Lincoln's society, to know a little more on this subject, because religion is important today, but it was even more important in the 19th century. I don't want to steal his thunder, but that's the reason I asked Chris to make this presentation. Without further ado, Chris Smoke.
Well, as Lincoln would say, you all know me. Or as they would have said, what good can come out of Nazareth? What good can come from a fellow Lincoln presenter? You know, I remember as a teenager, when we moved to Illinois, maybe you don't know, but I lived here in Illinois as a teenager. I think we moved when I was in my very first year of high school, and we moved from Maryland. I finished out that year, just kind of finished it up doing correspondence back with the old school, and they sort of did my grades that year, what have you. And then for the next several years, I did home study through correspondence studies for high school. And I remember one of those classes, of course, was American literature. You remember your American literature class? Some of you remember it fondly, others of you remember it not so fondly. But I would sit in my room there. Most of the time I would sit on my bed, and I was one of those weird kids, you know. Partway through the year, I realized if I got up and get dressed and actually make myself presentable, I'm more likely to study than if I just sit around. So I would take part of the morning, and then I would actually put on a tie, and I would sit in my room and sit there and do my studies, and take the tie off when I was done. I was done with studies. But I remember doing American literature class, and of course we had to read all these different things. But one of the things we read was Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God.
Amen.
Indeed. Now, was that in your American literature class?
Yes.
Some yes, some no. You know, I read that sermon, and I was simultaneously mesmerized by its really graphic language, and slightly horrified, too, by its really graphic language. And I realized, I think, at that age, I must have been 15 or 16, somewhere there, I realized what an impact that these very old speeches and sermons had on our country. And later on, as I studied more into religion, I realized these are things we're still talking about and still arguing about. And these are things that impacted not only individuals, but nations. And of course, as we study the Civil War, we realize how much, or I came to realize how much religion had to do with the war. There's several things when we talk about the Civil War and religion in Lincoln's day that we have to understand as a groundwork and a framework. When Joe gave me this assignment, even up through this morning, I think the topic still sort of overwhelms and terrifies me just a little bit because it's such a huge topic. American religion in Abraham Lincoln's lifetime. It's a huge, huge topic. I mean, there are seminary classes and college classes and graduate classes that are taught on this, not just on the overall scope, but on one little tiny particular denomination or even part of a denomination. You know, so this is a huge, huge topic. So today as we look at it, think of ourselves as passengers in an airplane. We are flying over the landscape at very, very high altitude. And we may drop down for fuel once in a while at some specific point, but we're just getting the very basic outlines here in the next 30 or 40 minutes. So when I read Jonathan Edwards and this sermon, it made me curious what people were thinking. When people came to America, what was going on? And really, the roots of the Civil War lie in what has happened before. You know that. I'm not telling you anything new. But there we have the Great Awakening in the early centuries, in the early 18th century. And what historians call the Great Awakening is a time of religious revival. And it was Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, some of these gentlemen, who were preaching that started this great religious revival in America during this period. The name Great Awakening came from a book by Joseph Tracy. He was a minister, a historian, and so forth. And he wrote the book in 1842 entitled The Great Awakening, in which he was looking back at this earlier period in American history, which was not so far removed for them. And he was examining the religious thought of the day, these ideas given by Whitefield and Edwards and others. And his theory was that it was their religious ideas which had given birth to popular democracy in America and thus had hastened the coming of the American Revolution. So in his mind, in Tracy's mind, the American Revolution was a direct result of the Great Awakening. Now, historians, of course, argue that back and forth, and you can find every position under the sun either to accept that position or refute it, which is kind of the way a lot of religion is, isn't it? And the more you study it, the more you realize that everybody has an opinion on it. So the first Great Awakening was this Christian revitalization movement that swept not only America, but also Great Britain in the 1730s and 1740s. And really the idea there was not so much of a missionary outreach, not trying to convert new people, but was simply, for the most part, looking at people who were already members of Christian faiths and saying, we need to be revitalized. We need to have a greater godliness in our life. And so as Jonathan Edwards is preaching, he's talking to a congregation who's already a part of his faith. And he's telling them, you all are like a spider. You remember this? You're like a spider in God's hand being held over this fire. And God's wrath is such against evil that he could drop you into the fire at any moment, as we might drop a spider into the fire, into the flames, and it would be consumed. But he says it is only God's great kindness and his mercy that keeps him from dropping us. So although his wrath is great, and that's the picture everybody remembers from that sermon, that he's ready to put us over the flame, Edwards also is telling his congregation, now is the moment when God's mercy is open to everyone. So please accept it now. And throughout this sermon, and I don't think Edwards was nearly as active in his moving around and preaching as I was. People say that he just sort of stood there and gave a slow, steady cadence. But such was the impact of this sermon that throughout the sermon people were crying out, "What must I do to be saved?" Echoing the call of the Philippian jailer in the book of Acts. And as he gave the sermon, people wept. And there was a great religious movement, not just that single sermon, but many of his sermons and Whitfield's sermons. People were being connected with now, not just on a theological level, but on an emotional level. And that was one of the great thrusts of the Great Awakening. That's important background to understand, because without the first Great Awakening, there would be no second Great Awakening. And the second Great Awakening in American culture is what impacted Abraham Lincoln and what Abraham Lincoln lived through. You have no idea how many pages of material I have for you. We're not going to get most of it. Remember, we're skimming across the landscape here. The second Great Awakening is a new Christian movement, a revival that begins in the United States in the early 1800s. So it really starts to get moving by around 1820 or thereabouts. So as Lincoln is growing up, this revival is beginning in the United States. The Second Great Awakening continues throughout Lincoln's life and even a bit afterwards, even into the 1880s. And so that would be the span. It sort of runs that way. It ends its lifespan in the 80s, but reaches its peak in the 40s and 50s. So just at that period where Abraham Lincoln is rising to prominence, so too is this Second Great Awakening and the Reformation movement in the United States. All kinds of things that are part of this. People are seeing themselves in a new light. They're thinking about their relationship with God and so forth. Most of it starts in what historians call the burned over district. Again, here's a term that comes from a writer of the time, Charles Finney, who wrote in 1876 about the burnt over district. He said that so many revivals had been held in this district in New York that there was nothing left to burn. There was nobody left to convert. They had all been converted. There had been so many different preachers, there were so many different camp meetings, so many different revivals, and everybody had religion. One way or another, at least they'd been exposed to it. So this was the burned over district in upstate New York. And a lot of things in the Second Great Awakening started in the burnt over district. You had a lot of different things going on there. We'll look at a couple of them here. Some of the things that began in that burnt over district were the Millerite movement. We'll talk about that again in a few moments. But a huge movement that swept the nation during the 30s and 40s. The Latter-day Saint movement. Most of us know that as Mormons. And of course we've heard this year about Mitt Romney. And so we understand a little bit more about Mormons this year than perhaps some of us have in the past. Also in the upstate New York district, the Fox Sisters and the rise of modern spiritualism that took place. The Shakers were extremely active and had communities in upstate New York. The Oneida Society. And in addition to these religious movements, you also had different utopian societies that were being founded. And of course, you had a great feminist movement with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others that was taking place all in this same area and kind of going in the same direction. A lot of these social movements were being fueled by the religious movement sort of in the background. A lot of people refer to this as a restoration movement or primitivism. You have the idea of the sense that the preachers of the day were trying to encourage their congregations to restore the church. You can take that in its largest sense or in their denominational sense. They wanted to restore the church to a primitive godliness. They wanted to take it back to New Testament times. And so many of these preachers were saying, we must go back all the way to the book of Acts and look at what the early church was doing then and try to emulate that as much as possible. So this was taking place. Part of that was a movement. this is where the terms get interesting. There's all kinds of terms that the historians and theologians throw around. But part of that was a restoration movement that was very specific to a group called the Campbellites and the Stonites. These were gentlemen who were preaching very specific ideas, and again, trying to encourage people to return to that primitive kind of Christianity. One of the huge developments that took place during the Second Great Awakening was the camp meeting. My church still practices camp meetings to this day. I don't know if yours does. Well, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist, and to this day in many states, Seventh-day Adventists come together from all over the state. And they have these huge camp meetings where people come together and there's preachers and they're sharing. And most of all, it's just fun seeing people you haven't seen for a whole year. You know, and that's neat. But during the Second Great Awakening, between the 20s, 30s, and by the time you got to the mid-40s, the camp meetings were huge. You know, the other day we heard that perhaps it was a circus tent that they found for the convention here in Decatur. Possible, but more likely it was somebody's camp meeting tent, because there were camp meeting tents all over this area because people were coming and holding camp meetings. And at these camp meetings you would have literally tens of thousands of people coming to attend and listen to the great preachers of the day. And they would bring them in from New York, they would bring them in from out east, but it also gave rise to a great number of frontier preachers who were very, very popular. And of course Lincoln would have been familiar with some of those, particularly Peter Cartwright, whom we'll talk about in a few moments. So the camp meetings was something that was very important there. Two other terms that we have to understand when we think about the Second Great Awakening are Calvinism and Arminianism. You ready to go to sleep now? I see some of you with glazed looks on your faces, and I'm feeling like, well, after the classroom. But real briefly, Calvinism is named after John Calvin. He was by no means the first person to talk about some of these ideas. Many of these ideas go way back to the early centuries AD. But the two great ideas of Calvinism were this idea of predestination. That, and I'm just going to paraphrase here, you can... Tell you what, let's make a deal. If you are interested later on, you may take one of my cards, email me, and I will send you a reading list, all right? If you want to get farther in that, I'll be happy to do that. I've brought a few books that you can peruse, but I'll send you a reading list where you can get into some of this in more detail. But the idea of Calvinism was this idea of predestination and election. That God had a certain group of people that He elected. Dennis Boggs is going to be saved. Denise, sorry, you're not going to make it. But this, this is in practical terms. Well, I should have switched that around, shouldn't I? But in practical terms, this is the way it worked. And so you had a whole gamut of people who believed in Calvinism. And growing up, Lincoln was part of a Calvinistic Baptist church. And he would have been taught these ideas of predestination, sometimes called fatalism, sometimes called, as he put it in his note to Peter Cartwright, the doctrine of necessity. These are all terms that sort of overlap at some points. And essentially it's the idea, what Lincoln said in his note was that some overriding force prompted a person to action, and there was nothing that person could do against the overriding force. And that was sort of the idea of Calvin, too. If God elected you, you were going to be saved whether you liked it or not. It was going to happen. You could fight it all you want, but at the end, He was going to get you. And on the other hand, if He had condemned you to damnation, then as much as you wanted to be good, you were stuck in the other place. So this was part of that idea. And again, it ranged a whole gamut from very strict to rather loose idea of predestination and election. So that was Calvinism. On the other hand, you had Arminianism, and the idea there was just the opposite, that people had much more free will, that perhaps God did elect people, but you had the choice of whether to accept. Again, it ranged a wide gamut as to how much free will you had and exactly how much control God had over your life. But these were the two viewpoints, the two overarching viewpoints over the time. And much of the Second Great Awakening was a great big argument over these two theological viewpoints and who was right and who was wrong. So that's very important to understand as you think through who Lincoln was and who the people of his day were and what they were teaching.
Have these, I've researched, and on the tables, I have the game set up. There's a direction card for each game, as well as a history card so that you can see. I also have a collection of children's books about vintage games that I've collected over the years at longer period of time. Excelled at physical games and mental games. He enjoyed a challenge. He was fond of playing checkers, showing right here on a vintage checkerboard with handmade checkers by my Mr. Lincoln. He was usually played a game very cautiously at the beginning of his checker games, and he was very defensive in the way that he played initially, until the game progressed along that it required more aggressive movements on his part in order to win. But he played very cautiously and very defensively. That was generally his strategy in checkers and also in chess. He was fond of playing 9 pins, and that's showing over here. And that 9 pins was often played on the larger version. I just have the tabletop version here. It's set up in a diamond pattern. You roll the ball and knock them over. So it's similar to bowling. And it would come in a larger, they had tabletop versions, which this is. They also had larger versions that you play on the carpet in the parlor. Let's see, he was a regular participant in chess, which is showing right here. And he especially liked to play that with federal judge Samuel Treat. And again, he played that very cautiously and defensively at first. And according to my research, Lincoln really didn't have a great musical ability, but he had a great ear for rhythm. So I have over here 2 rhythm things that would have been used, claves. So maybe some of you want to just tap out the rhythm for some of those playing Chinese checkers. And a box shaker. Mr. Lincoln could go around doing the rhythms there. Okay, let's see. He was very athletic. As we know, he's remembered well for his jumping, and so therefore I have jump ropes here, although in the hoop skirt I'm not going to demonstrate that one today. You can try that. You've got the nice floor here for doing that. Running, wrestling, and playing ball. So he was very fond of exercise and, as they say, all kinds of fun. So without further ado, let us all begin all kinds of fun here today. So first, I'm going to demonstrate a couple of things. I think you should know how to play most of the games here. What I'm going to do is in a moment have you all come in here and pick a partner or pick a game, and a partner will join you here, or you can come up and look at the ones that I have here. I have a stereoscope, which this is really cool. Everybody needs to see this. The one I have in here is a little boy with the Board of Education. You're going to want to check that out. It also has something about Lincoln and the stereoscope. And if you've been to Lincoln Home, or if you're going, Lincoln did have a stereoscope, but it was much fancier. It was a box, an actual piece of furniture that he looked in, but he used the same stereoscope cards that was actually invented in 1838. So he very well did have a stereoscope. But one game that was very popular, and you may not have tried, and right here is the hoop. And the way this works is you put the hoop down, you have the stick, and you hit the hoop about right here and push it along. And then, so it can go pretty good by itself, but you have to run alongside it and keep it going. So But you can just try it. It'll actually go quite a long distance with just the right touch there. So some of these things, you know, as a teacher, what I've learned, you don't have to be an expert at these games to demonstrate them, to teach them. And many of my students can do these things a lot better than I can, but it's just kind of fun to, of course, know the technique. Because sometimes you try and it just flops right over, but it should go quite a distance there. So I've got that. We can go right down the center on the hardwood here. The next thing is we're going to demonstrate. We had a demonstration of this in the ladies' tea. This is a game called Braces. And I have two sets of braces. And there's one here and one there. And each player used two sticks and one hoop. And the hoop is placed over the two sticks. And then I'm going to fling this, and he's going to attempt to catch it either on one stick or maybe both. Ready? All right, well, here. We'll try one more time. Oh, there. Go ahead. Yeah, no, go ahead. Oh. Well, you get the gist of it. Whoa! Good job. All right. So, without further ado, as I said, I invite you all to come on in and let's try the game. Let the games begin.
Yes, I did lots of them now.